New reporting by investigative journalist David Zweig reveals that California's Santa Clara County surveilled its citizens to ensure they complied with harsh COVID restrictions back in 2020. Indoor gatherings were banned to limit the spread of the virus, but the pastor of San Jose Calvary Chapel had enough of the lockdowns and decided to open his church back up 2 months into the pandemic. Fast forward 3 years and 2 lawsuits later, court documents now show the extent to which the officials there went to keep its citizens in line, possibly infringing on their rights. Here to discuss the details of this massive surveillance operation is the author of the report, David Zweig. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Robbie.
So let's get right into it. Give us the story. What was going on here? So the church defied the orders and then was the subject of attempted, legal intervention. Tell us how it went down.
That's correct. So Santa Clara County is probably the harshest, or certainly in the top tier of law enforcement operations regarding pandemic restrictions. They were the first among a few other counties to impose the sort of stay-at-home orders initially in March. And what happened was they never rescinded those restrictions on gatherings indoors at churches for 7 months. So 2 months into the pandemic in May, there was a pastor at a large church in San Jose, California, which is in Santa Clara County. This is Silicon Valley area for anyone listening or watching who's not familiar with the area. And in May, he publicly said, "I'm done with this. I'm opening the doors to my church. My church members are suffering. There's people who have depression, people who are feeling isolated. It's been 2 months. I got to let them in." And that sort of launched this battle between the church and the county, which is still going on today with a federal lawsuit and a state lawsuit.
And there were times at which, because they could, so talk about this, it was specifically eventually for churches, was it not? Because you could gather in other contexts.
So this was one of the most remarkable things that I discovered in my reporting, was that at first I thought this was a story about a county health department with a really zealous enforcement policy, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, in the interview now about what they did with the surveillance operation they did on the church and its members. But what surprised me was I thought they were kind of doing this on everyone. But in fact, there were long stretches during the pandemic when stores could be open, including up to 50% capacity, when churches were allowed nothing. And then once they shifted the guidelines again and they said, okay, now we'll allow churches to have 25% or 100 people, whichever is fewer, at that point in time, then they said there's no limits at all if you want to go to the mall or a liquor store or wherever else. So this was a whole other component I wasn't even expecting when I started researching the story, this sort of complete divergence that if this was truly based in public health, why would a mall be allowed to be open with no capacity limits, but yet a church was limited, and this is a huge building, limited to 100 people. It didn't make sense to me.
So I'm reading from your report, the Santa Clara County Health Department used cellular mobility data to track how many people were attending Calvary Chapel on any given day. Tell us more about the surveillance aspect of this that you uncovered.
So there were 3 components. It was sort of a 3-prong approach that these, what they called these enforcement officers, who they hired, the public health department hired to monitor people. And what they did was, first, they started doing these stakeouts around the church. They used an adjacent property, which was another church who agreed to let them kind of set up camp there. And they peered at the church through a chain link fence and were spying on the various, traffic operators in the parking lots, the greeters. And I quote all this in my article. I take screenshots of the various declarations and documents in the legal case, because it's thousands of pages long, but it's remarkable reading this sort of minutia of what they were documenting. The greeter hugged 3 people, 2 of which were not wearing masks. So this is one component, this almost like farcical, very strange, highly detailed stakeout monitoring that they were doing in the church. The second prong is they went into the church itself after a judge gave them a temporary restraining order, which gave them, it empowered them to actually go in. So they were monitoring small prayer groups. There was a thing called Manna for Moms. It's like this thing with moms with small children and infants. And there were monitors in there from the government watching these activities take place and writing down reports. And then the third prong, which you mentioned, was they also employed a really vast scheme of what we would call a digital sort of mobile surveillance, where they paid for data from a company called SafeGraphs that had the cellular mobility data. And then they hired a professor at Stanford Law School to write up an analysis of the data where they were monitoring the churchgoers, how many of them were attending church on any given day.
Yeah, that is incredibly disturbing because from this data, you can't extrapolate who the individual, like in the surveillance, the people are not discernible, but you could follow them back right to you can track their moving, so you could figure out from the data who was who.
Yeah, I mean, they say that it's anonymized, but obviously if you're watching, I'm figuratively speaking, but if you're watching a dot on a map move to the church, all you have to do is track that particular cellular device back to where they're going at night, and then boom, you know who is there and who is staying at home. So it would be very easy. I'm not saying that the county did this, but it would certainly be easy to do. In my report, I include an image. It's just quite remarkable. They have this thing that they set up called a geofence, which is this sort of digital perimeter around the church in this red line. And then within the church property, they even made special lines for different buildings. The data was so granular using GPS that they actually not only tracked church members going into the church, but they knew which individual buildings they were in at any given time. It was a remarkable report. You would think this is something related to, a big spy operation on illegal arms dealers or something. These were people, the infringements were that they weren't wearing masks, that they were gathering, and that they were hugging and singing.
It's incredible and dystopian. So this is SafeGraph. So they were a contractor essentially for the county. Is there concerns about, would they just give this data to the county? And I mean, do they keep a copy of it? Do they, who gets access to this? Because obviously there are tremendous privacy concerns, not only in this case, frankly, but in theory for anything, for being able to track people's whereabouts, or if people are in different places than they say they are, where if they go to an abortion clinic, if they go to a gay bar, if they go, it's.
That's right. So what's remarkable is most people don't realize, but when, many of us, on the various apps on your phone, if you have a weather app, for example, when you arrive in a new city on a trip, it knows where you are. All of these little sort of tracking that the apps on our phones use then can get that data can be purchased by these outside companies like SafeGraph, and then SafeGraph then bundles that data and sells it to buyers, including the county health department. It's also used by academics and researchers for epidemiological purposes. In my view, from what I've read about this really is the Wild West as far as what we all give up as citizens and what private entities, or in this instance as well, working in concert with a public entity like a public health department. Mm-hmm. So Santa Clara not only tracked these churchgoers, prior to that, they were watching all the residents of Santa Clara, and they were watching how many of them, this is back in around Thanksgiving of 2020, they wanted to see how many of them were leaving the county and coming back. And one of the people in the meeting mentioned that they saw a lot of Santa Clara members, which is in Northern California, were traveling to Southern California, where the COVID rates were higher, and they were concerned. So the amount of observation of the individual citizens is remarkable. And when you look at this geofence that was created, it's quite amazing just to see how detailed these data were. And again, this is, when you think about the violations that we're talking about, this is a pretty vast operation that they had underway. And so right now it's all being hashed out in these two legal battles.
I mean, it makes you concerned, I think, for what a government would be able to do, technologically speaking, if it was as, determined as the county was, and then also, I guess, had an enforcement or more of a desire to enforce. In a lot of areas in the country, right, there ostensibly you're not supposed to gather. Ostensibly you're supposed to maybe wear a mask unless you're like literally exercising even when you're outside. But there wasn't the enforcement mechanism was like being shamed by your neighbors or something. But if you really wanted to keep people in their homes and keep them wearing masks, you could set up a tracking system. You could follow people. You could see from the data, oh, this person left at this time. And technologically, that's totally possible. So then all it would require is actually enough of permission to government policymakers to actually enforce that.
Well, yeah, and more or less that is what happened here. So it remains to be seen how the courts are going to rule about what happened and what powers a county health department really has to be doing this type of incredibly invasive surveillance. And again, it's the digital surveillance of the mobile data is really just one piece. The fact that they were kind of peering through this chain link fence and writing up reports, the fact that they, after they got this temporary restraining order, forced themselves inside the church on repeatedly. We're talking about every single week for months and months and months on end. This is pretty intrusive stuff. I'm not a religious person myself, but this is something bigger than just the freedom of religion. This is about human rights as Americans and our rights to privacy, right to assembly. Here's a really important piece of the story that's remarkable. The Supreme Court of the United States struck down California's ban on gathering in churches in 2021. After they did that, the county dropped its complaint about the gathering, all of these millions of dollars of fines for gathering violations. So right now, the suit is focused simply on masking violations. So we're talking, it's $2.87 million right now that they're suing this church for. Remember, we're talking about cloth masks. This is the only thing, nothing higher than that was mandated, that pretty much every single health official now publicly acknowledges that there's no evidence that cloth masks are an effective mitigation strategy, at any sort of meaningful level at a population level. So, and they've been admonished by one of the judges to just drop the case already. This is crazy, and they won't. So we have millions of dollars of fines they're trying to impose because people weren't wearing masks, 2 years ago. It is an astonishing case.
Amazing. David, thank you so much for reporting on this and talking about it with us. We really appreciate your hard work.
Thanks for having me.
More Rising right after this.